So this passage is well known and well loved throughout the years. Artists have been depicting this passage for years. And you saw a picture of a wood cutting for the title. I've got 3 other pieces of art to share with you, and I am not an art teacher. I was a music teacher. I am not great at art criticism, and I don't know all the nuances of art. That was Barry's job. And but I want you to look at these different paintings from different times of the year. So, Chris, will you give us our first one? This one comes from 1733. It's actually a miniature that was originally painted in Armenia, which is just east of Turkey today. At the time it was being painted, it was in the middle of the Ottoman Empire. Daniel of Urank, said that he wanted to illustrate all these different Bible passages that we find in the Gospels, because his family were longtime Christians living in the midst of the Muslim world. So they could share these miniatures paintings. Now, when I look at that one, honestly, I'm not super impressed, because art has come a long way. I don't see a whole lot of emotion in this. I don't see a whole lot of motion in this. It looks very static, but keep in mind, this is over 600 years old. This is 50 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. The second painting is more familiar to us. This is a painting by a German romantic. What I love about this one is the energy that you see. And I think the artist also does a beautiful job of capturing the entire story in one passage. You see the tumult of the storm, you see that uncertainty, but yet where we see Jesus and Peter, you see that calmness that Jesus provides. I think it's a beautiful piece of art. And finally, our third painting is by an African American who is an American who was painting around the 1900s. His father was an AME bishop, so you know he grew up hearing these stories. And I love this painting because, to me, makes me ask the question, where is Jesus in that painting? Is Jesus the guy in the white robe, or is Jesus that blob that's over on the right side? Because when Jesus came walking across the water, they thought it was a ghost, a phantasma in Greek. And they were like, it's a phantom coming. Who is it? So we see, who is Jesus? Clearly, maybe, maybe not. And I think that's the beauty of this piece of art. So thank you, Chris. These artists who painted these pictures had to make choices. They interpreted this story, and they based their artwork on the choices they made. The composition, the use of colors, the use of facial expressions. It was intentional choices that they had to make. Today, as Susan well knows, preachers and teachers of the Bible go to commentaries. And there is so much in commentaries. And people who write commentary also have to make choices. A lot of times there's this understanding of what the language really meant, because in translation, you miss some things. And there's also explanations of historical context and what the life for these people was back then. But many commentary writers also say that these passages are a lot deeper than just that surface level story, that there are theological understandings that are in these passages. I think that's part of the reason why we have 4 different gospels, so we can see 4 different ways of understanding who Jesus is. So what we're going to do quickly, and my original sermon was 35 minutes. I promise it will not be 35 minutes. We're going to quickly walk through parts of the story at that surface level. And I'm not diminishing the story and saying that the surface level is not important. This surface level is incredibly important. What we learn just by reading these stories is beautiful. So, One thing you need to know is the disciples, at this point, when they are in the boat, are exhausted. The disciples have been following Jesus for weeks now. They have been surrounded by crowds. You know they're not getting sleep because they're walking all over God's creation at that time, and it was huge. The Sermon on the Mount had just happened. They'd received news that John the Baptist had been murdered because of his saying, the Messiah is coming. And these disciples are tired, they're confused, and it's like, what are we doing? So Jesus knows that, and Jesus almost forces them in the boat. The Greek word is almost forced. It's in our translation today, it was they put him in a boat. No, Jesus forced them in a boat and said, I'm going to catch up with you. Don't worry, I'll take care of everything else. So Jesus goes and dismisses the crowd and goes to pray. The disciples have been out on the Sea of Galilee, which we call the lake, for hours. The Greek translation, the Greek writing says it's the middle of the fourth watch. So that's about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning before the sun comes up. And Jesus has pushed them out to the shore, and they are supposed to sail across, but there is a strong headwind. And the winds on the Sea of Galilee in some storms could get up to 40, 50 miles an hour. And so these guys are trying to get across the lake, rowing or sailing. We don't know exactly which way, but they were trying to get across the lake, and they were exhausted. And in the middle of the night, they see this thing coming. What is it? We don't know what that is. We're in the middle of the lake. What could that be? It's got to be a ghost. But Jesus walks up and says 3 things to them. Jesus walks up and says to them, take heed. It is I. Fear not. Now that phrase, it is I, is beautiful. In Greek, it's ego eimi. And that phrase can be understood 2 different ways. It's a common way of speaking about yourself. Think about if you're in your living room and all of a sudden you hear your back door open and you're like, who's in my house? And you shout out, hey, who's there? And you hear this voice say, it's just me. And you go, oh, that's my nephew. Yeah, I was expecting him. I forgot. Yeah, come on in. I'm in the TV room. That's one way that ego eimi was used. But ego eimi was also used in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. Ego eimi is the words that the Greek uses to translate God's answer of Moses' question. When Moses is commanded to go back to Egypt and release the people, Moses says, who's being sent? And God says to Moses, say, I am. Ego eimi. I am who I am, has sent me to release you. It is the proper name of God. And Jesus, in using ego eimi, that common phrase, it's beginning to look a lot different to the disciples. It's a beautiful passage. And then that next part, be not afraid. Don't worry, I'm here. But it also can be translated as fear not. How many times have we heard fear not or be not afraid when people encounter God in the Bible? Jesus is beginning to tell these disciples who he is. There's that part where Peter steps out of the boat and where Peter starts walking across the water, but then he starts sinking because Jesus says to him, well, what are you doing? You have little faith? Why do you doubt? But I think it's important to know that Jesus never uses you of little faith to someone who is not a believer in Jesus Christ. It's always used for people who are believers. And Jesus, maybe little is not an insult. Maybe little is not a denial of something happening. Because Susan, 2 weeks ago, preached the parable of the mustard seed. And she talked about how the kingdom of heaven is like a tiny mustard seed that grows and becomes huge. Jesus also says in other places in Matthew, if you have the faith of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, go and move, and the mountain will move. So the idea of having little faith is not necessarily an insult. It's not that you don't have faith. It's that you're still growing in your faith. And one more thing I want to talk about here before I move on is this idea that this story is actually a repeat. Because if we go to Matthew 8, listen to this story. This is Matthew 8, 23 through 27. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm suddenly arose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. They went and woke him and saying, Lord, save us. We're perishing. And he said to them, why are you afraid, you of little faith? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was dead calm. They were amazed, saying, what sort of man is this, that even the winds and the seas obey him? It's the same story. Outcome is the same. People are still saved. But what is different, and the reason I think why this story is repeated in Matthew, is the disciples who change. In Matthew 5, the disciples are, who is this guy? We've been following him. We've given up everything we've had. We gave up our jobs. We're no longer with our families. But who is this guy that even nature obeys what he says? A few weeks go by, and now, same experience. And the disciples, when they ask themselves, who is this guy? Their answer is different. They praise him and say, truly you are the Son of God. Their understanding has become clarified. I find it interesting that the only other time in Matthew where this phrase, truly you are the Son of God, is used is at the crucifixion. And it's when Jesus has been killed and the Roman centurion, someone who does not believe, acknowledges that this was the Son of God. I don't think that's a mistake that Matthew wrote it that way. So, I could go on and talk about all these different understandings, theological understandings, but I don't want to do that. I want to share just one because I think this applies to you. This is a conversation that started, a couple years ago in my seminary class. We'd spent about an hour and a half, 2 hours dissecting this story. We looked at the original Greek. We did all these different what-if scenarios. And towards the end, the professor looks at us and says, all right, so Peter's walking out on the water and he starts sinking. What was Peter's mistake? And we give, as classmates, we all give the answers that we thought, the answers that we'd always heard before. You know, he took his eyes off Jesus. He got distracted by the wind and he wasn't able to fully concentrate. And so he started sinking and the professor says, yeah, those are good. But let me throw out this idea. Jesus' first mistake was he got out of the dang boat. And we went, yeah, right. What are you talking about? You got out of the boat. Why is that a mistake? And our professor said, there is this understanding that the idea that the church was actually the boat. That the church that the early disciples were forming, those followers of Jesus, were in the middle of this tumult. The religious authorities were starting to come after Jesus. The Roman authorities were starting to say, this man is causing problems and disturbing the peace. At the same time, they're hearing these stories of this radical coming kingdom, and it didn't make sense. And they are all confused. And Jesus, when he walks to the boat, is coming to help the boat. And Peter's mistake, my professor said, was to step out of the boat. Now, I love my professor. I respect him. He's a wonderful teacher and a scholar extraordinaire. But I think my professor missed the point too. I think sometimes we're actually called to get out of the boat. Like Peter, we are called to get out of the boat and take a risk. Why? So we can get closer to Jesus. That boat, our church, provides us comfort. We have relationships. We are nurtured here. We are loved here. But sometimes we got to step out in a step of faith and go and do something different. Because y'all, I hate to say this, and we all hate change. But if we only do the church for ourselves, are we really the church? If we only do church for ourselves, churches begin to lose being the church. As Christians, we are called to go out into this world and go and help the world grow closer to Jesus. And you, Edgewood, you have done this. I hate to bring up the selling of the building again because I know it can cause issues, but y'all, that was a huge leap of faith. That was a huge step to say, maybe God's leading us in a new direction. And as a group, you all stepped out of the boat and said, we want to get closer to you, Jesus. Help us. Now, we all know that we're not back in the boat yet, that we're still struggling, but Jesus has extended his hand, and Jesus is reaching out to us as individuals, but to us to you as a church, saying, there is a new direction I want you to go. Don't get rid of the boat. Keep the boat. The boat is good. But yet, and I'm going to say it, the bad word in the Presbyterian church, but we're called to evangelize. And we're called to go and save the world by our actions. We don't save the world, but we help open up the eyes of the world. So what are you being called to do as a church? And that is a big question. So I encourage you to sit together in conversations during meals to start saying, who are we called to be in this community? Why are we still here? What is God calling us to do? Neil Richardson last week, I also watched his sermon last week. Neil said that it is very obvious that there is love in this church. And I would second that emotion immensely. Love for each other, but more importantly, love for God. So the question is, how as a church can you go and share that love in the greater community? Start talking about the things that are passionate in your heart. It could be a feeding ministry. It could be helping the unhoused. It could be working with women and young people who have been abused in their houses. Start thinking about ways, small ways, that you as a church can go and move forward, growing closer to God. So my charge to you is to go and always keep your eyes on Jesus. Amen.